You're listening to America's Most Challenging Issue, where BahaiTeachings.org interviews community builders across the nation who are inspired by the Baha'i vision of the oneness of humankind. Join us as we explore their work, bringing about racial unity and establishing a more just and equitable society. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. Justin DeLeon is a man of many interests, an educator, scholar, photographer, filmmaker, and public speaker. His dynamic multidisciplinary practice questions oppressive systems of power rooted in racism, gender inequality, and colonialism. A child of immigrants, Justin's parents relocated from the Philippines to the U.S. in the 1970s. He maintains dual citizenship with his ancestral homeland and the country of his birth. In his early 20s, Justin learned about the Baha'i faith, embracing it years later in the mid-2000s. His critical analysis of global systems of power and the innovative ways besieged communities resist domination has taken him to Nepal, India, Cambodia, the Philippines, Thailand, Northern Ireland, Honduras, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. The international scope of his research and service embodies the Baha'i teaching that, quote, "It is not for him to pride himself who loveth his own country, but rather for him who loveth the whole world. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens." He holds a PhD from the University of Delaware in International Relations with a focus on Native American and indigenous tribes, gender and women's studies, and media studies. He is a Rotary World Peace Fellow, an award-winning documentary filmmaker, a TEDx Talks Fellow, a member of the Global Feminism Research Collaborative at Vanderbilt University, and is a visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. In this episode of America's Most Challenging Issue, we sit down with Justin to find out first if he ever sleeps, and second, how his scholarship and life are framed by the transcendent teachings of the Baha'i faith. Justin DeLeon, welcome to America's Most Challenging Issue.
Thank you, Masood.
So good to have you here, man. We're going to jump right in because I am anxious, as I'm sure our listeners are, to hear your story and just where you've been and what you're doing now. So I wanted to begin by asking you a question in reference to Ralph Ellison's 1952 masterpiece, The Invisible Man, in which the protagonist, an unnamed African-American male, wrestles with the social implications of erasure, a complication of race, right? That some people overlooked or ignored because of the inconvenience of color. And now we know that in the Baha'i faith, diversity is a fundamental element of creation, that in a very real sense, right? Oneness or unity is predicated on the dynamic force of difference. So much of your work, whether it be in filmmaking, photography, pedagogy, or public speaking, seems to be directed towards a recognition and awareness of, and an appreciation for, the various ways marginalized communities exercise agency and preserve cultural identity. Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, says, "Know you not why I created you from one substance, that no man should exalt himself above another." I'm wondering if you draw a connection between your practice and the inherent nobility of humanity implied by this statement.
Great question. Yes, I think about a lot of times about this notion of inherent nobility. But I'd also say that quote that you mentioned also implies a humility and interconnectedness, I think, in there as well. I'd say along with that, or in that vein, before I continue, I think it's important for me just to situate myself ever so slightly, to take care not to be authoritative in nature, especially when it comes to writing and talking about the Baha'i faith, but also doing my best to try to avoid any homogenizing effect that I may have. So anything that I'm sharing, of course, this is just, my own single experience of trying to explore humbly what it means to set into motion the teachings and learnings that I've had from the Baha'i faith. So I try to internalize this notion of every individual having an inherent nobility, but I also try to internalize humility and interconnectedness. As you mentioned, I work with the Lakota Sioux in North and South Dakota. And one of the key concepts of the Lakota is this notion of Matakio Oyasin, which translates to this idea that it translates to this notion of all my relatives, or we're all related. And so it's this spiritual reality that we're all connected. And it comes from this understanding of the human spirit having multiple dimensions to it. And this was explained to me in great depth by our dear friend Kevin Locke. But with the Lakota folks, they believe that there's 4 aspects to the human spirit. And so the first element to the human spirit is this notion of the life breath, which is essentially when, let's say, the bear passes, its life breath moves into the next world. The second element is kind of crudely akin to a ghost, right? So my ghost spirit can speak to the bear's ghost spirit, can speak to the tree ghost spirit, and so on and so forth. The third one has to do with the essence of that being. So a bear is known for its great strength, but also it's very much in tune with the earth. It can smell a root up to 6 feet below the ground. So it's connected to the earth. And then the last one is this notion of that we all come from the same cosmic dust. We're interrelated with everything around us. And so when you take that framework and you internalize it, then you start asking, what are the possibilities and what are the implications of being interconnected to everything? What are the outcomes and operationalizations of unity? And this is the same question that we ask ourselves within the Baha'i community. When we look at the core activities, when we look at social action and social discourse, we're trying to figure out ever humbly and however long term, what are the implications of operationalizing unity? So not only do you see this notion of, I would say, interconnectedness in the Lakota community, but you also do see it as well in some academic spaces. And I think of particularly the revered scholar, rightist, activist, poet Audre Lorde, right? Who has this incredible essay around how the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. And in there, very similar to all the stuff that we see within the Baha'i writings, and as you had mentioned in your introduction, the dynamic force of difference, right? So she says that the mere tolerance of difference is the grossest type of reform. It's the worst type of reform. That we actually need to see difference as a creative function, right? And she says that it's, and this is similar to Abdu'l-Baha. He mentions this notion of 2 Flintstones coming together and creating a spark. She refers to the same thing, 2 stones coming together to create a spark, and that spark is the necessary function of difference that can help us animate a new world, a new envisioning of the world. So she contrasts this idea of seeing difference as being something that's fearful, right? That we see a lot in today's discourse, as just something, as difference as something that's necessary to actually move into a creative mode where we can explore new facets of who we are and what we can be, right? So in some of the scholarly literature, there is this strong orientation towards interconnectedness, right? And that interconnectedness obviously also values one's inherent nobility. So I try to take this idea of nobility and interconnectedness into the classroom. I think that's a space where it's very visceral, the outcome, and it's also very immediate. One of the techniques that I really love doing in our class, so I've been teaching at UC San Diego for 2 years. I am affiliated with Vanderbilt and now Notre Dame. And I teach about race, class, justice, gender, right, indigeneity. All of these are very divisive concepts in popular discourse. So one of the first things I really like to do, and of course within this space of discourse, people really get entrenched ideologically. What I like doing in this classroom is I'll ask the students at the beginning of the class to write a personal narrative to me, something that I won't share with anyone else. And I ask them to move along the spectrum, first asking, what do they feel their purpose in life is? And then moving to more operationalize that, which is, what do you think the goals of your life are? What are your experiences with this class, the themes of the class? And how do you think this class can help you with your goals in life and who you are and want to be? Inevitably, what's really beautiful is that about 99% of all the students, they respond that their purpose in life is to take care of others, to be of use, to be of service to other people. And then they go on and go. And then about maybe 3 or 4 weeks into the class, I'll ask permission from the class to take some of those narratives, to take all of those narratives and to share it with the class. And I'll tell them that I will anonymize it and no one will know any of the identifying details. And then what I do is a week later, I turn off the lights and I tell them just to think and listen. And I'll read 1 or 2 sentences from every single response that the students give me. And what's so beautiful is that you see an individual narrative, one that's often based on fear and exclusion, start transforming into one that is a collective narrative, that is moved into acceptance and love and recognizing this inherent nobility. And so I'll read one section and one of the students will say, that's me. In their mind, they'll say, I wrote that. And then the next few sentences will say, wait a second, I wrote that. Wait, I wrote that. And almost every single thing that people write, you can relate to and or you think that you read it. You wrote it yourself. And so they start seeing not only the shared humanity, but then they also start seeing a very deep-rooted interconnectedness, right? And after that moment, when I read that for 20, 30 minutes, there's a sharp transformation in the spirit of the class. They start seeing that they might be different in their ideological background or conviction, but inherently, they all want the same outcome. They all value and share the same values that they otherwise wouldn't have thought that they did.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I love this idea of interconnectedness that you talk about. And it kind of leads into my next question, because, you've been fortunate to travel to many countries around the world. Your research is focused on diverse communities outside of your culture of origin. And oftentimes one of the challenges in developing intimacy with those of different backgrounds, particularly those who have been subject to sustained transgenerational trauma, right, is this notion of trust. And I wanted to know if you could speak a bit about the spiritual virtues that inform the manner in which you approach your work with these diverse populations.
Great. I think I need to speak a little bit about my motivations as to why I'm so interested in difference and also colonial violence. And that stems from my family background. You had mentioned that my family relocated in the 70s, and my grandparents moved in the 50s. And we moved from the Philippines during a time of a unique time of, you'd say, maybe colonial forces, right? My parents and my grandparents moved as, in a sense, racialized bodies. I had a great-grandfather, great uncle, I think it was, who had to dig his own grave before he was executed by the Japanese. I had a great-grandparents and great-grandfather who was fighting colonialism and imperialism first against the Spanish and then the Americans. So this is to say that there's a long history my family has of sort of being entangled with these colonial violences. And then, unbeknownst to me, and not to anything that I've done in my own life, we moved to the United States. And now I make home in the Ohlone territory near the Bay Area. And although I'm a product of colonial violence, now I'm reinforcing and replicating some of those same colonial violences of displacement and of erasure. So the larger project that I have in my life is to try to figure out how, as both a producer and a product of colonial violence, what type of responsibility does that put on my shoulders, right? How am I implicated in different ways? So that's where I come from. Now, that whole exercise that I just went through, it's part and parcel to this feminist research conviction and critical research conviction around this notion of reflexivity. Reflexivity is this sort of constant reflecting upon the positions that we occupy. And when I say positions, I'm talking about the structural positions of power that we occupy, right? Sure, I'm a racialized individual in the United States, but I'm also a cisgender male. right? When I go to the Philippines, I'm a Western educated academic. So your position doesn't always remain as maybe the oppressed or the oppressor, right? It's very dynamic and fluid. And so the notion of reflexivity allows us to explore what are those dynamics around each of those individual positions that I may occupy. How can I leverage particular positions to work on behalf of justice and so on and so forth, right? So all of this implies this idea of, one, trying to be honest with yourself and your own intentions. It implies this idea of humility. My work that took me around the world was mainly around development. And what I found in that space is that good intentions are not enough. Back in the day, and I'd say maybe 60s and 70s, there was this movement called the Green Revolution, which was a very simple problem and a very simple solution. I should say a very simple solution to a complex problem. People were starving all around the world, and Western technocrats said, okay, if we have people starving, let's do something. Let's transfer technology from one location to the next and use genetically modified seeds to increase crop yields, and therefore poverty and also hunger would be eradicated. So this worked. So this happened in Punjab, which translates to the land of 5 rivers. And it worked for the first generation of farmers, or for the first generation of crops. You had great, outstanding yields. But what happened was, in order to sustain those yields, you needed to have large monocultures, and you needed technology to support those monocultures. Where did the seeds come from? Where did the technology to support those monocultures come from? It came from the West. So you had this growing dependency on outside influences or outside injections. So what happened was, because you had you had large monocultures, that led to great deforestation of the farming land. And you had extreme famine in that space that literally translates to the land of 5 rivers. You had famine, and you had desertification to extreme lengths, and you had to increase numbers of suicides from farming. And what was that based out of? That was based on these technocrats who had great intentions, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for their work, but it didn't actually work. So you have to come at these projects with more than just great intentions. And as some of the guidance within the Baha'i faith, I think of the 1999 document, I think it's Promulgation of World Peace, something to that effect. You'll have to check that on your own. But the House of Justice wrote a document about development, and it conceptualized, and it pointed to a problem with the conceptualization of development purely being material. That in fact, development is material and spiritual. And until we recognize that, we're always going to fall short. So this is to say that how I approach communities and thinking of difference is I really internalize the fact that we are spiritual beings having a material existence. And as a result, we don't exalt ourselves over the next person and the next person. We're all learners, right? We're all learners in this project. Now, here's the reality. Sometimes we have friends, Baha'i or non-Baha'i, who have great intentions and say, well, I don't see race, right? And we all know that's a problem. And so how is that a problem? Well, here's the problem. Let's take, for example, former President Barack Obama, right? He could go and explore his Scottish and English roots. And matter of fact, he should do that. No one should tell him otherwise. He can do that, and he should do it as much as he wants, right? But at the end of the day, when he's walking down the street, the police, the society, the shop owner, they still see him as a black man, right? So you have this notion of positionality, of who you are and your identity. And some of that is internal, individual. Filipino American, I'm a Baha'i, I'm all these different things, and I should explore those things. The second part of the positionality is structural or external, which is how society reads you, right? I can't control that. Those are subjectivities that are bestowed upon me, right? So if you say you don't see race, that's great individually. But structurally, when you go outside, society still sees race, right? Baha'u'llah tells us that the soul has no gender or race, right? But at the same time, Baha'u'llah says that we need to eradicate all forms of prejudice, right? So there's a spiritual truth that we are spiritual beings with none of these attaching identities. And then there's a social truth that creates certain subjectivities that allow us and position certain peoples lower than others, right? So what I'm drawing here is this difference between structural analysis and individual analysis. I can walk through the world with all sorts of individual convictions, but structurally, I'm seen as read and treated as something different. So I have a close friend named Yasser Payne out of University of Delaware, and he did this incredible study in inner city Wilmington, Delaware. And he had some results very similar to what I had shared with you previously, that overwhelmingly people want to help and people want to be good. But in relevance to what I'm telling you now, he worked at a high school where Black young men were not graduating at a shocking rate, over 90-some%. And what he said, and he teaches methodologies, classes at the university, he said that when you see such a glaring statistical number, what that means is that it's not an individual explanation, but what we have here is structure that is coming into play. So when you see large outcomes that are structurally puzzling, or say statistically puzzling, you have to then say there's something structurally that's happening to influence these outcomes as such. So that's just a sort of a long-winded answer of saying I do my best to try to internalize this notion that we're all material, or that we're all spiritual and material, but then understanding what it looks like in operation and trying to sort of separate the individual experience and the spiritual experience from the structural reality.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Thank you so much, because I think quite often when we do this analysis of racism, and people will say, I don't see color and so forth, but they're negating the fact that the notion of color is a social construct that has real world sociological implications. And I love the way that you were very clear in the delineation between the spiritual reality, right, and the physical reality. So thank you so much for that, Justin. It's really, really wonderful. Yeah. One of your principal areas of interest is your ongoing work with the indigenous communities, which you just spoke about, of North America, particularly the Lakota Sioux of South Dakota. You've continued to explore the creative ways this community has worked to resist the dominion of oppressive power structures. And so much of the experiences of Native Americans is framed by this history of determination, if you will, as expressed most profoundly by a deep respect for and a reliance on the spiritual dimension of human existence, right? And thinking about the journey of African Americans, I see clear lines of intersection between the two cultures. The moral impetus of the civil rights movement was rooted in spiritual truth, for example. And recently I was in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I was struck by the disproportionate rate of poverty amongst First Nation peoples in contrast to this relative affluence around them. And it reminded me very much of the ghettos in New York or Detroit or Chicago and Atlanta. And yet these communities are far too often consigned to the margins of our society, even though they have the greatest need, right? Quite often it is as if they don't exist. Now, Baha'u'llah says that, noble have I created thee. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created. But if we do not see that nobility in ourselves and in one another, what are the repercussions? And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about this idea of invisibility and the consequences for all of us if we refuse to see one another.
I think it bears mentioning that within the Baha'i writing, there's a special place for African-American people, likened to the pupil of an eye, the most important function of the eye, which lets in light and reality into depths of being, spirit, and process. And also with the Lakota folks, Abdu'l-Baha tells us that at a certain point when indigenous people in North America take their rightful place in a sense, that they'll become so spiritualized that they'll be able to illumine the entire earth, and that the spiritualization of society largely rests on or it can be quickened through indigenous peoples. So I think it's important to look at the contrast between how society constructs the self-identity and the subjectivities of Black folks in the United States and indigenous folks in the United States, and contrast to how they are depicted and held in such high regard within the Baha'i writings. There's a deep discontinuity between those two things. I think that's important to just point out. Second, I'd say is that we can't underestimate the influence of intergenerational trauma. The way I explain this often to young people I work with is I say, think about that time in 4th grade, 3rd grade, where someone said something mean to you, where what they said to you influences how you think of who you are today. And you could almost conjure up that moment where someone was really mean. You can conjure up their name, and it influences who you are as a person today. Now imagine if that person didn't just do it once, but did it twice. What if they did it every Wednesday for your entire year? What if they grouped with their friends and they did it every single day of that entire year? What if they teamed together with the teacher and they actually had it every single class? They did that to you. And then they went beyond that and they did it to your brothers and sisters. They did it to your mom. They did it to your grandparents, right? If one slight and one issue and one moment of being made fun of can influence who you are as a person today, could you imagine it being magnified, 100-fold, right? Because that's what happened with Indigenous people. And that's what happened with our African-American brothers and sisters, right? It wasn't just a one-off slight. It was a generational, constant, daily slight, saying that you don't have that self-respect. You don't deserve that self-respect, right? And so I think that it's one needs to recognize that in order to heal from that intergenerational trauma, it's not going to be overnight. It might take multi-generations to heal from that. In this project that I worked on with some other folks, I think it was like last year, maybe a year and a half ago, it was this hashtag project called I Am Not a Costume. And we interviewed young folks from the Standing Rock Reservation who were involved in some of the water protecting that happened there in 2016. There was this one gentleman who said, he said that what happens when you first hear racism, especially directed towards you, you're not intellectually developed enough to process it. So you just sort of swallow it. It's like swallowing poison. Someone says something you don't have to do with it, you don't have to do with it, you swallow it. And after a while, you keep swallowing poison. And that's not good for you. And at some point, it's going to affect your life. You don't know how, right? You don't know why, but you don't know how. I mean, you might, if I swallow poison today, maybe a few years from now, I might have, digestive issues, right? It manifests itself in different ways, but ultimately it does manifest itself. So much so, you had mentioned you're in Canada recently. It was just 2 years ago that a First Nations community in Manitoba had to declare a state of emergency because in 2 weeks, they had 140 suicide attempts in 2 weeks. That's swallowing poison. That's intergenerational trauma, right? So I wish I had an answer to this, and I don't. But I think going back to that sharp contrast to how African Americans and Indigenous peoples in North America are held in such high regard within the Baha'i writings, and then how our society today treats those two populations. Something there is not matching up, right? And something there is still holding that progress back, that progress of being able to step into and recognize each other's presence as you talk about invisibility. So one of the things I think is important to look at here is I want to introduce this concept of logics of oppression. So oftentimes when we're talking about different types of oppression, we kind of move into this like, oppression Olympics. Well, we had a worse genocide. Well, we lost 6 million here. Well, we did this and so on and so forth, right? When we go back to those notions of interconnectedness, we realize that it's not about stacking chips and who has the worst grievances, right? It's not about that, but rather it's about being attentive to the different logics of oppression that influence and infuse our daily lives, right? So let me just give you an example. Here's a logic of oppression that worked across both the Black community and the Native community, right? So with Native communities, there's this notion of blood quantum, and that's a policy that was put forward by the U.S. government because part of the, I guess you would say, policy or the approach to Native peoples back in the day was, well, if you give up your arms and you allow yourself to be part of the U.S. project, the American project, then we will promise you that we will, one, keep you safe, two, and that we'll also provide you food and education, so on and so forth, right? And so to do that, the U.S. government wanted to make sure that they could tell the difference between a Lakota person and a non-Lakota person, so on and so forth. So they used this notion of blood quantum. So they would test people's blood, and they would also see your genealogy, and you would have to say, well, I'm full-blooded, or my mom is Lakota, my dad is not, so I'm 50%, right? And so on and so forth. So you're looking at ratios of blood in order to identify who's in, right, and who's out. So this, if you think of it, just think of the logics. Take a step back and think of the logics. You're not marrying your sister. You're not marrying your brother, right? If you think of those logics, the logics are genocidal because you're going to be spreading outside of your community. You can't keep everything in. And if you did, you probably will die anyways. So the logics of blood quantum are genocidal. You're only getting smaller and smaller and smaller until literally there's nothing left, right? Because why did the United States want to interact with the Native people? They wanted the land, right? In order to get the land, you needed to eradicate the Native people. Now, let's move over to the Black community. What did the United States want from, right, the African slaves? They wanted labor, right? How do you increase labor? They also use genetic sort of testing and markers, but they called it the one drop rule, right? Which we're all familiar with, which was literally if you have one drop of African blood, you are considered Black and enslavable. And so think of those logics. Those logics don't decrease. Those logics increase, only increase. Why? Because, right, this project, this American democracy needed land and it needed labor. So you see that there's certain logics or certain moves that are around maybe the same subject or the same tool, right? All to maximize certain inputs and eradicate other inputs. Right. And so when we start thinking about the logics of oppression, it starts becoming a really generative space of thinking because it moves fluidly as power does and oppression does across peoples of color, across all sorts of difference. And so that's where I think it's really important to start thinking about. That's where I think the generative conversations can be, right? Not just about identity politics, not just about Black community, Native community, Filipino community, trans community, but where these logics really show themselves.
Yeah, it's that's such a compelling point because the reality for me is if we all descend from the same God, then the interest in the welfare of my brother, irregardless, or my sister, regardless of where they come from in the world, what socioeconomic strata they occupy, it's in my interest to make sure their interests are taken care of as well. You talked about this notion of intergenerational trauma and how those sustained slights impact populations, communities, individuals. And when I was in Canada, I had the real blessing to be interviewed for Vancouver Co-op Radio. And the co-host there was a woman named Ganarji O'Sullivan, First Nation sister. And she was speaking about this idea of erasure and invisibility and how she felt like, the plight of indigenous communities, both within North America and First Nation peoples in Canada, doesn't get the attention that it deserves. And she says that she was saying that how she feels like the society doesn't even know what to call First Nations or indigenous communities. And I instinctively, without even thinking, I said, I know what to call you. And she said, what? And I said, beautiful. And you could see the light just come over her and this smile, this recognition that someone had seen that, which is very evident to me within her. So, as painful as these slights are, with sustained encouragement and love, we can actually move people to a place of healing. And it was just that one comment that I made that sparked something in her.
One thing that comes up that I think is quite useful in thinking about how to push back in a sense, or to build in different ways. My background's in international relations, and there's this fixation on the study of power, right, in international relations. But I think it's useful to bring up because it also shows us avenues of building. And the largely there's 4 forms of power in international relations. The first one is like coercive power, which is essentially military. The second is, you would say, structural. And structural would be these sort of long-standing cleavages in society of race, economic well-being. It's almost kind of inherited difference over time that reaches these big cleavages. The third one is institutional, which is like you and I, Masood, we make rules for all of society and then we leave and they still have to follow. And then the fourth one is this notion of productive power, which is this idea that what we put out in the world produces, and then it turns around, what we put out in the world is a product of society and then turns around and produces society. And this is where I think language is so strong, right? By you just shifting that framework of language, it opens up a whole new sense of interaction. This is why we find it so objectionable when films hypersexualize or depict people in stereotypical ways, because it's not just a product of society, but it also produces society. So I just mentioned this because, there's levels of thought that we can change and challenge in terms of working to build something. But then we also can say, okay, well, someone needs to work on maybe the international institution level. Others need to work on these deep cleavages of inequality, while others need to just literally stop fighting from happening. So there's just different levels of intervention that I think your anecdote really points towards, which is really beautiful. And then just to that point, I have a really great friend. Her name's Tanea Winder, and she's an incredible indigenous poet. And she was speaking to one of my classes the other day, and she had this really great analogy. She said, there's a story of these 3 sisters walking by a river, and they see these babies floating in the river. And so the first sister immediately jumps and says, oh my gosh, I got to do something. And she jumps into the river and starts grabbing these babies. And as she's doing that, she looks over at the side and says, sisters, why are you not helping me? Come in here and help. And they say, no, we're not just sitting here idly. We're going to go run up the river and we're going to go. One sister says, I'm going to go jump in and I'm going to go and turn the babies upside down or right side up so that by the time they get to you, they won't be drowned, right? That they could breathe. So she goes running up there, she jumps in. And as she's doing this turning, she looks at her other sister and says, sister, why are you not helping? Right? Jump in and help me. And sister says, no, I am going to help. I'm going to go run upstream and I'm going to try to find out how the babies got into the river in the first place. And I'm going to try to stop that. So this is to say that there's so many different levels of intervention. One of them as simple as language, as you so nicely put. Just shifting the way that you refer to someone when they're sort of grappling with navigating against these colonial forces can completely transform a space. But is that all we need? No, of course not. It's so much more, but that is certainly one area of intervention. So thanks for that little anecdote. That was nice.
No, brother, I appreciate you so much, man. As I was researching you, Justin, and, I was so interested in your personal journey, your experience growing up in a racialized America as a child of Filipino heritage. And I wanted to know if you could speak a bit about that. You did earlier, but if there are some other anecdotes you wanted to share. And then if you could kind of shift into how you learned and eventually embraced the Baha'i faith.
I really became a Baha'i in spite of not wanting anything to do with religion. I'm Filipino, so in the Filipino
never heard that story before.
Maybe it's shared. I don't know, but we all have these scar tissues with our interactions with religion, and as growing up as a Filipino that are very traditionally and ceremonially Catholic, there's some things that I was working towards. I saw a lot of discrepancies, a lot of talk, and not a lot of action. And so when I was learning about human rights and international development when I was in college, I came across some Baha'is who were in England, who were from Germany. And in a sense, they kind of, it's kind of like, those cartoons where someone's making a pie and they leave it next to the window and you see the smell of the pie going out and all the bears and animals smelling it. They sort of put something in front of me that was so sweet scented that I couldn't help but not be attracted to it. Right. And there's certain things that really stand out. Things like, work done in the spirit of service is the highest form of worship, we're told in the Baha'i writing. We're also told that light is brought into this world not by lip service alone, but by, quote, patient lives of active service, quote. I remember reading this notion that the essence of faith is the fewness of words and abundance of deeds. And those things really resonated with me because I felt that, I think it's important that we all question our beliefs all the time. And I did. And I still grapple with that like everyone else does. But one thing that I do know is in my control is that I can act. Right. And I can live my faith through my actions. And I can continue to explore my own faith and my own belief through actions and through creative actions. Picking up a paintbrush, it's likened to the act of a prayer. The song of a musician can act as a ladder to the soul, bring people into these higher spiritual places. So I think that there's just such a beauty and a gentleness that was wafted in front of me. And it was a breath of fresh air because I had only known punishment and guilt. And so I wanted to step into the light. I wanted to step into the beauty and know that I may always think of my actions as insufficient, but a marker of that is my actions. And if I really put those beliefs into action, at least, however insufficient I may feel, I still have that to grab to grab onto in my religious practice.
It's wonderful.
Thanks.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much, man. We're talking about action. I'm thinking about the current plan of action for the Baha'i world community, right? We know that one of the principal areas of focus for Baha'is around the world is this community building initiative referred to as the core activities, which includes a series of activities such as children's classes, junior youth empowerment program, devotional gatherings, and all of these intended to strengthen the spiritual and material life of human civilization. And I wanted to know if you see your work as being informed by this initiative, and if so, in what way, how?
Great question. I absolutely do. One of the things that I think about when we think of the core activities is that essentially they're theories of change. Each of these processes, and they're mutually reinforcing, but each of them individually is one way to think about how change can happen. Right? Well, if we have spiritual conversations and prayer with our neighbors, change can happen. If we educate little kids about virtues, change can happen. If we work with teenagers and around service, change can happen, so on and so forth. So they're all theories of change, which I think are really important. One of the things that really, in a sense, kind of gave me this lifeline, gave me renewed purpose, stemmed from around 2009 and 2010. In 2009, the Universal House of Justice wrote a letter to the National Spiritual Assembly of Australia, and they introduced, along with the core activities, they introduced two other lines of activities that we could be considering. One is engagement in social discourse, and the other one is social action. And this was in 2009, 2010, reinforced it. And we're told that the core activities, expansion and consolidation, engagement in social discourse, and social action are all mutually reinforcing. And that, in fact, we should be careful to say that those are not the only three avenues of service, but right now, these are just ways that we can think of how to order our activity. One of the beautiful things about the Baha'i community is that we've had experience, and it's growing in expansion and consolidation. Two things we don't have experience in are carrying out social action and engaging in social discourse. So our institutions and also individual believers are exploring those last two avenues, and hopefully more and more insight is being gained. But because we had this introduction of social action in public discourse or social discourse, it really allowed me to start seeing that all of these things can weave together this beautiful fabric of social change, right? This beautiful fabric of community. And so really where I really focus on are these contributions to social action and social discourse. One of this great project called Lumen Media up in Toronto, and they were asked by the World Center years ago to just start doing some work in the field of public discourse, of social discourse. And so they decided to create this film project called Lumen Media. And basically it's these little series. It's a series of films about issues that young people face. It's kind of like if you're familiar with Degrassi High back in the day, it's something akin to that, but a little different. And they started making these programs. And one of the really interesting things that I learned from speaking to the folks who are involved there is that they've been asked to reevaluate what their mechanisms for evaluation are when it comes to film and media. We're both we're both media makers, and often when we think of how do we evaluate a project, we look at how many views it had, how many locations it played, what film festivals, what awards, so on and so forth. But they've been asked to do something different. They've been asked to say, when you produce a media content, how evaluate it in terms of how has it contributed to the community building process? How has it drawn more people into the core activities, to further engagement with social discourse or social action, right? And when we think of that, it completely transforms our evaluative structures of media and social discourse and social action, just full stop. And that's really exciting to me. And that's where I've placed myself to try to learn, which is if I internalize the values that I've developed through reading the Baha'i writings and engage in action and discourse, what can be learned in ways that actually contribute to this larger process of change and community building, right? And I find it actually quite difficult to find other communities that have such a hyper focus as that. You might be in activist spaces, you might be in development spaces, you might be in filmmaking spaces, right? And you get so caught up in the day-to-day being appreciated, right? And the day-to-day awards and so on and so forth that you lose sight, or it's easy to lose sight, that everything that we're doing is aiming towards this rolling out of this old world order and this rolling forth of a new world order. So that's how I see my work engaging the core activities and engaging the three paths of action that were identified by the House of Justice. And part of that also is that I think that it begs us, encourages us to find coherence. If we work with junior youth in some of the trainings, it talks about this notion of false choices. Do I serve or do I study? Do I do a family or do I work? All these false choices. So it's really pushing us to think of coherence. And so when we think of coherence, can we think of social action and social discourse and community building all being the same project, right? In my work, can I bring in the ideas around social action and social discourse that are influenced by Baha'i writings into the classroom? Can I see our community building projects within our own Baha'i community as the exact same projects that we're working with in the classroom and in my writing? These are questions that I'm trying to explore, but they all point to this idea of theories of change and rolling out a new world order.
Well, we are just about out of time, man. I'm going to tell you, we've burned through some amazing content. And before we go, I wanted to ask you, what gives you hope about the future for humanity? And how much of that hope for you is derived from the revelation of Baha'u'llah?
I have high hopes for the destiny of humanity. I pointed briefly to how a lot of my students really say that they want to be a better person, they want to contribute to society. But I think a lot of my work really stems from all of our desire to draw closer to the divine, to beauty. I'll just share a few quick anecdotes that all point to this. I had the opportunity to work with a great scholar named Erin Murphy Graham, a Baha'i over at UC Berkeley. And she was doing this multi-year study on this program called SAT, which is a rural education program in Honduras. It's a Baha'i-inspired project. And I was filming the director of this nonprofit organization, dear Mr. Suhail. And I was alone with him, and I asked him, I said, you must be so happy and proud of your efforts because thousands of students are now being pulled into this incredible project. And he sort of closed his eyes a little bit, and he kind of looked up, and he just humbly shrugged his shoulders and said, I hope it's acceptable. And here I was thinking that here's this gentleman who's in charge of this large nonprofit affecting the lives of tens of thousands of children. And he's meekly saying, I hope it's acceptable. I had another experience with this young lady in Kenya who she was abandoned by her parents and she was put into this orphanage. And we were interviewing her, and she was sitting on the road, this dirt road, and we were sitting with her, and we were having this long conversation as the sun was setting. And all of a sudden she started singing, and it was in Swahili, so I couldn't understand it, but it felt so powerful. It was sort of supplication. The next day when we were actually leaving Kenya, I showed that clip to our producer who is Swahili speaking, and we were at the airport, and our producer is this big, muscular guy, and he immediately started crying. He started translating this beautiful song that she was singing, and it translated to this idea that said, Dear God, when you're sending your rains down, when you're sending your gifts, don't forget us here. The last little thing is, I remember having a conversation with a dear friend of mine on the reservation in Lakota territory. And we had this long conversation. And before we left, he said, Justin, there's so many human beings in this earth and we're reaching 7 billion. And he said, there's a chance, however small it may be, that when we move to the next world, it might be you that gets to stand before the face of the Creator. And he said that if that's you, if on the small chance it's you, please tell the Creator to not forget us, that we're here working on behalf of Grandmother, Mother Earth, and that we're here trying to live in a good way and to not forget us. So I think of the quote from one of the Baha'i prayers that says, make me as dust in the pathway of thy servant. And then I think of that idea of patient lives of active service is what brought light. Yet another thing I think about is this notion of, there's a prayer that says, if we're not happy and joyous at this season, for what other season shall we wait? And for what other time shall we look? There's no doubt that the evils of racism, as referred to in some of the recent guidance, is ever pressing. And there's no doubt that what we've inherited is a quagmire and is awful and terrible. And as Shoghi Effendi tells us, we should be angered, and we should be angered, and we should be unhappy with what we've got and what we've inherited, but we should not be confused. Right? Shoghi Effendi tells us that, and we're reminded in some of our recent guidance that we shouldn't be confused. We can be angered and dismayed, but not confused. And why are we not confused? We're not confused because we know that what is afflicting humanity is a spiritual affliction. Right? And we know that the tools that we're trying to bring to the table are inspired by spiritual realities of oneness, spiritual realities of justice. So the last thing I'd say is that Shoghi Effendi reminds us about 70 years ago when he wrote that we here in the United States are the spiritual descendants of the dawnbreakers, who shed their blood and their efforts to bring light into the world. And we're the spiritual descendants of them. And then we're reminded that we should never forget that high destiny that's in store.
Well, brother, man, thank you so much, Justin, for all of the really extraordinary work that you're doing, and for this compelling conversation, man. I mean, this has been such a joy to my heart. I feel inspired. I feel lifted up and even more informed after having spoken to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you for your time and efforts.
It's been a pleasure, brother. You've been listening to America's Most Challenging Issue. I'm your host, Masood Olufani. And remember, disunity is a danger that the nations and peoples of the earth can no longer endure. The consequences are too terrible to contemplate, too obvious to require any demonstration. The well-being of mankind, Baha'u'llah wrote more than a century ago, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. From the Baha'i Writings. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.